So it's kind of cold and crappy out, so I thought today I would talk to you guys about something that really confuses me, which is paranormal fiction. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about paranormal romance, or maybe I am. The problem is I'm not actually sure, because I hear paranormal romance thrown out a lot. That makes kind of sense to me. You know, vampires falling in love with werewolves, blah blah blah. But then, what is paranormal fiction without the romance? Wikipedia has the very helpful definition of paranormal fiction is a genre of fiction whose stories revolve around the paranormal. Okay, so yeah, that's super helpful. So if you look at what they mean by paranormal, they say it's beyond the range of scientific explanation, blending together themes from traditional fantasy, science fiction, or horror. So now I'm not really sure what it is. What makes it different from horror? What makes it different from science fiction? What makes it different from fantasy? I mean, if you look at what Wikipedia has about paranormal, it's things like ghosts and extraterrestrials and things like that. And that makes me think way more sci-fi than paranormal. Like, when I think paranormal, and when most people, I think, hear paranormal, they're thinking of this book. Chick falls in love with over-controlling sparkly vampire, chaos ensues, babies are named terrible things. Like, that's kind of what I think of when I think of paranormal. But again, that's paranormal romance. So, what is paranormal when you don't have the sexy sparkly vampires? And, if we're thinking of paranormal as kind of horror and things like that, I mean, could this be paranormal? This is City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. It has vampires, it has werewolves, it has demons and angels and crap like that. But it really reads to me a lot more like urban fantasy, which Wikipedia a little more helpfully defines as a subgenre of fantasy defined by place where the fantastic narrative has an urban setting, which, definitely occurs in City of Bones. All of this happens in New York, because obviously vampires live in New York. But the stories can also take place in historical, modern, or futuristic periods, as well as fictional settings. But they must be primarily set in a city. So now I'm still not really sure how this is different from paranormal or urban fantasy, whether it's a little bit of both. Which one would you put it as? There is some romance, so is it paranormal romance? But then, look like things like Shatter Me. It's kind of paranormal. She has these supernatural powers. It's also a little dystopian. And again, is it more dystopian because it's in this futuristic apocalyptic setting? But then dystopian I put way more with sci-fi. But then we got these superpowers. So is it dystopian or is it paranormal? I mean, I'm just so confused by this. I would love someone to explain this to me. Please, in the comments, leave your thoughts, because this is something that's been baffling me forever. And I know it's not a huge deal, I put my little tag marks on a book, I can just put paranormal and urban fantasy. But as someone who's interested in publishing and marketing and things like that, it's something I'm really interested in. How am I going to market this book? Who's the audience? Is calling it paranormal going to get me different readers than calling it urban fantasy? I'm guessing probably yeah. I mean, I find myself straying away from things called paranormal because I think of paranormal romance. Basically, what I can seem to understand is that paranormal tends to be a little more urban. That seems to be how it really differs from horror. Although, again, I'm a little confused. I guess horror is generally supposed to be terrifying. Maybe paranormal are the ghost stories where you have, ghosts falling in love with humans and shapeshifters and things like that. So maybe a show like Supernatural would be paranormal. Oh, that's pretty scary, so maybe it'd be horror. Then paranormal versus urban fantasy. I don't know, I guess you really have to think about, is the focus on these supernatural elements, or is it more like creatures and fairies and things like that? But then again, looking at something like this, it's sort of a hybrid, because you have both of those things. And again, I'm having a really hard time figuring out where paranormal is without paranormal romance. I mean, if you look at the paranormal fiction article on Wikipedia, the biggest part of it is actually a paragraph on paranormal romance. I mean, I kind of get that, it's Twilight and things like Twilight. But again, I'm still so confused, and I feel like I've just been rambling this whole time, but I think the problem is it's really not something that I've been able to wrap my head around. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on what you consider to be paranormal fiction, whether it necessarily has to be paranormal romance, and how it differs from things like urban fantasy and horror, and dark fantasy, which gets even more confusing because then you're combining fantasy elements with horror. So, things like Anne Rice, which to me feels a lot like paranormal. And then my head gets confused again. So I would love to hear your thoughts. And I've also linked some other articles by other bloggers who seem to have a much better grasp on this, in case you're looking for a different take. So yeah, please help me figure this out because it's been driving me crazy. Peace.